days for everybody, and I'm very excited for our last panel. Okay, so I will get started then, just while we wait for the other people to filter in, because I know we're going to have a lot of discussion to get through today. So welcome back, everyone, for our final discussion of the conference. I can't believe it's come to this point already, but here we are. And in this discussion, we'll be discussing the importance of representation in education, and the importance of creating inclusive environments and practice for children of all backgrounds. So we've brought everyone back in together for this discussion, as we think it's a really, really useful conversation for all of us to be involved with. And hopefully it will generate a lot of food for thought for you when you go back into your settings, whether that be tomorrow or next week. And yeah, we're really excited to learn from the speakers that we have here today. So at Move, we know the value of creating inclusive and accessible education for children with additional physical needs. It's our bread and butter. It's what we do all day long. But we've been having some really interesting discussions, both internally and externally with colleagues, and really challenging ourselves on what else we can do to ensure the workforce within the education sector and the environment within those education settings can do to make sure we're truly representative of the young people that we support. So I'm very excited to learn from everyone we've got here, and let me introduce to you who our panelists are. I'm going to make sure I read this out because you've all got very long and exciting bios. I don't want to miss out anything important. So our first panelist is Kamran Malik. Cameron's worked in the voluntary sector for over 20 years, and for the last 15 years running user-led organisations. Since 2017, Cameron's been CEO of Disability Rights UK. He served on various boards of third sector organisations and was also a member of Transport for London's Independent Disability Advisory Group for 3 years. Cameron contracted polio as a child and is a wheelchair user, and his experience at both special and mainstream schools have showed him that inclusive education for all children is essential. He's driven to make sure younger disabled people have better opportunities than he did. So we're really excited to hear from you, and welcome, Cameron, to the discussion. We also have Joanna Grace. Hello, Joanna. So Joanna is the founder of the Sensory Projects, which is an organisation that works nationally and internationally to promote inclusion. I know a lot of people in the chat already know you, and are very excited that you're here. Joanna's work focuses on people whose primary experience of the world and their meaning within it is sensory. For example, people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. Joanna provides training and consultancy for organisations looking to improve their inclusive practice, and has also published many books and articles regarding sensory engagement work. So welcome, Joanna, and thank you for being here today. And then finally, many of you may recognise Becca from her incredible keynote speech yesterday, which everybody loved. Rebecca is our third and final panellist and is an interdisciplinary researcher with a career spanning space, atmospheric and health sciences, which is very exciting and sounds quite scary to me. She's currently at University of Liverpool delivering open source software for sharing, access and immersive data visualization of sensitive health data. And Rebecca holds significant expertise in science communication and also in public engagement, working with schools and funders nationally. Becca is passionate about increasing diversity in STEM, particularly amongst ethnic minority groups and people with disabilities, and is a disability activist committed to improving inclusivity within the academic sector. So a huge welcome to all of you today, and thank you for taking the time to be here. We do have some questions to guide the chat. If any of you want to add your own questions as attendees, do pop them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll try and get to them if there is any time at the end. But I'm going to start with you, Kamran, and just to ask you what your experience of education was like.
Thanks, Charlotte. Really pleased to be here and to join such a great panel. So I'm going to talk through kind of what my experience was starting when I started education when I was in a special school, and came to the UK when I was 6 years of age. So my first introduction to education in the UK was through a special school. And I guess I'm going to show my age. At that time, the school was called School for the Physically Handicapped, a word that we absolutely do not use anymore, the word handicap. And I remember it being in big blue letters on top of the school. And of course, at that age, I didn't really understand what all that meant. But what I discovered, and I think my parents also found, was that while in that particular setting, at that time, my health needs were taken care of. So I would have physio, I'd have people around to support me to kind of walk with calipers and walking frames. But there was no academic ambition. There was no academic track. There was no kind of push to see intellectually how far can we push people. So that setting you up for the future, really. I think it almost felt like, thinking back about it, the assumption was that you were probably not going to work, and therefore, will kind of occupy your day. It really didn't feel like I was on any particular academic plan compared to my older brother, who was at that time, it was O levels, the predecessor to GCSEs. He was kind of picking options and learning really. And the other thing I discovered was I got bullied in the special school by other disabled people, and particularly I got bullied by a young guy who had become spinally injured, so he came to experiencing disability from a non-disabled person's perspective. And so he was really angry at the world, I guess, and he took it out on me. And I guess I felt like an easy target. I wasn't very confident. I wasn't very confident with English. So they're the memories I have. And then I guess the other overarching memory I have now, reflecting back on it, was I didn't see any disabled members of staff, certainly not visibly disabled. And if there were staff who had a hidden impairment, they certainly didn't talk about it. So it was this idea of non-disabled staff team. It felt like they were looking after me. So that was my experience in the special school. Then at the point when we normally would pick our options, so I was the first year that did GCSEs, I got moved to a mainstream school. And that was a completely other, a mixture of really good and bad experience. So the bad experience was I suddenly felt I got moved from that special school into mainstream school, where there was what felt like 1,000 other non-disabled students who were all very curious about me because I was the only visibly disabled person. So again, experienced bullying from groups of younger kind of students around. And the school didn't really deal with that very well. They didn't really know how to cope with it. I couldn't pick all the options that I wanted to do because areas of the school weren't accessible. And so no adjustments were made for that at the time. I was just told, for example, I wanted to do physics, and that was upstairs, so I couldn't pick that option. And then in the end, it was because my parents really pushed the school that for my physics option, I got sent to a different school who had a lab downstairs. So it was really disjointed. And of course, the other bit I didn't have was access to the kind of the social aspect of school. So, when people hang around on the streets after school, you don't want to go home. You want to hang around with your mates. Well, I didn't do any of that because I had a mini cab that used to come and pick me up, right on time and would take me home because the school wasn't near where I lived. So there was no other way. So I never had any experience of that. And what that meant was I struggled to make good friends, because I think that's where your friendships and the social kind of skills is where you learn that. So really mixed experience. But I guess what I did get was a bit more of an academic track. I had a lot of catching up to do because in the earlier years, I didn't really have that level of education. But again, the overarching thing was didn't see any disabled teachers. And I certainly wasn't aware of any teachers being open about the fact that they had an impairment. I think one of the best things that we did in that school was I really connected with a drama teacher in the final year of my A levels, which I stayed in the sixth form. We ran a disability awareness kind of week through the drama teacher, and really to explain to every other student in that school what life was like for disabled people, what it meant, what was different impairments, and those kind of, so that I did that at the end. And then I went to university. Because of family reasons, I didn't go straight away. I started working and studied part-time. And again, at university, although certainly I didn't experience any bullying, so that was great, but I did experience a huge amount of lack of access. So I remember being carried into exam rooms because they were in sports halls that had steps. So rather than finding another option, that they asked a couple of students to carry me in. On one occasion, I was dropped, which meant then I was taken into hospital with damage to my spine. And so my kind of A-level degree took longer to get. So it was kind of that lack of support, lack of kind of knowledge about adjustments. And you were kind of expected to fit in with what what the institution felt was the norm, and that you had to fit into that rather than the other way around. And again, didn't see any disabled disabled kind of tutors, teachers, or in the academic staff. So I think that's always been the overarching thing for me, is not seeing, I guess, role models within that world that I could look at or talk to or kind of engage with.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your experiences, not only of mainstream, but also of the difficulties you experience in special education as well, because we often talk about accessibility issues in mainstream settings, but sometimes we don't think about that in special education settings as well. So thank you. And yeah, that importance of role models, I'm sure, is something we'll come on to in a second. Does anyone, Joanna or Rebecca, did you want to add anything on that in terms of your experiences of education? Becca.
So I acquired my disability after I graduated, but I just through work and my involvement in academia, I have spoken to a large number of disabled students at different universities, and I would say that I think kind of the messages that I'm getting from them, that when they start, before they start university, there's a team of people that will help them with essentially an accessibility plan or a support plan to allow them to participate in their course, and they're really happy with that. The plan meets their needs, but where the issue is that I think the plans aren't enacted in a consistent way across perhaps all modules of teaching. So and all, because what you're asking for every single lecturer to be made aware of that individual's needs and to adapt. Obviously there's things around adapting the rooms that are being used and stuff, but also perhaps you might have to adapt the types of activities that you do in your actual teaching as well, and the way that students participate in your particular course. And it is a big problem. It's a difficult problem. It's a complex problem to solve, given the volume of students you have, and the fact that every student that has additional needs is very tailored and specific requirements. So I wouldn't say that things have changed in universities, perhaps since you were at university, Kamran, but it's slow progress, and there are still these additional barriers, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think, yeah, lots of food for thought already from many of our attendees. Thinking about representation in education then, Joanna, how important is representation in education? And, our students that we work with so much within MOVE, seeing themselves represented within the workforce, what value can it bring both to the person, to the individual in that setting, and also to society as a whole? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the thing with representation across all forms of difference, not just visible disabilities, but race and gender and hidden disabilities, is how invisible it is. Because if you have it, you don't see it. You don't notice that you've got it. Whereas, and if you don't have it, you don't see somebody who looks like you or who is like you. And so it's quite a difficult topic to get people to appreciate, because if you haven't got it, you don't realize you haven't got it. And if you've got it, you don't realize you've got it. It's a very invisible thing, but the power of it is very well known. There's all sorts of research to show the value. Becca will be able to talk about the importance of representation in STEM. There's been a huge campaign to push women in STEM, hasn't there? I remember reading a research article about the effect of Barack Obama's predecessor on the public speaking skills of young people of colour in America. And of course, you could look at, if you're a person of colour, you can look at a white person speaking and think, oh, I could do that. It doesn't make any difference that my skin's a different colour. But that instancy of they're like me and they do that, it's so powerful. And in terms of representation, for myself, I'm autistic. So my experience of school was also very difficult. In the main, it was difficult for me, not for my teachers. I was a very good student, but I would love to see more neurodivergent representation. I know a lot of teachers who are autistic, but who are scared to come out publicly because of the prejudice around the condition. And so this week is like a good news week for the neurodiversity movement, because Melanie Sykes and Christine McGuinness both came out as neurodivergent this week. And having public figures like that go, yes, this is me, is so wonderful for me and my neuro kin. I'm so delighted that that's happened. But most of my work focuses on people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, and the visibility of that population is so important when it comes to campaigning for things like changing places, toilets. If people aren't seeing these people, and I don't just mean representation within professional, I literally just mean seeing, seeing in the supermarket, seeing, when you go out to the cinema, we don't see people because there's not toilets, because the world isn't accessible. And so I really want to flag up the work that wonderful bloggers do by making people visible. So people like Emma Murphy and Lucy Williams and Rachel Wright, who all blog about their children who have profound and multiple learning disabilities, they are part of making this population visible, and it's a very brave thing that they do, and it's fab. I tweeted them all into your Move conference hashtag before we started, just in case people were looking for them.
Yeah, we'll make sure we retweet those, because I just saw those come through, and I think that's so important, and it's something that everyone here watching today can take away as a really concrete action from this session. We all have such a role to play in raising the profile, the visibility of the students that we work with. And yeah, exactly, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. It's brilliant. Does anyone else want to add anything on that at all, about the importance of children seeing themselves within the workforce, within their school? Becca, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just had a little, I guess, a little story about this. I once gave, so it's about the fact that representation in, the teaching staff, for example, when you're an undergraduate at university is hugely important. I remember once I gave a talk about disability inclusion. The audience was largely staff and students that were members of the disabled staff and student network at that particular university. And I remember at the end of the talk, a third year undergrad approached me, and she was a wheelchair user as well, and I'm a wheelchair user. And she told me that she found the talk really emotional. Like, she was really quite emotional when she was speaking to me. And it wasn't the content of what I described. It was the fact that for the first time in her degree, she was in a room with other wheelchair users. And the rest of us were all staff. We happened to be staff at the university, working in different parts of the university. And that really showed me that the impact of just seeing other people, people in the workforce, people in the education sector, researchers, active, professors even, that are disabled, just for students to see that is really important to them.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a powerful story that sums it all up, isn't it? And that phrase, "you can't be what you can't see," just springs to mind constantly. Cameron, did you have anything you wanted to add on that at all?
I agree with everything that both Joanna has said and Becca's just said. Absolutely. I mean, from my own personal, so I'm a wheelchair user as well. You maybe can't tell in the video, but not seeing yourself reflected in society, in the media, in TV, in drama, in professional circles is a really big thing. And you almost don't realize that you absorb those things. Even as a disabled person, you start to absorb the idea that those spaces are not for you. And as a young child, not seeing yourself reflected in the world around you has profound impacts on you throughout your life. And so, one of our things that we do at Disability Rights UK is around changing this narrative and perception of who disabled people are and what we're about, because we are teachers and doctors and architects and scientists and charity workers and everything in between, but those people aren't seen and not visible.
And I suppose we've talked about the value then to the individual within that. What about the value to society of seeing disabled people? Go on, Joanna.
So I was just about to cut back in and say, when we talk about representation, we often talk about it as benefiting the particular group that's being represented, but a representation of diversity is beneficial to all young people. You know, it's got specific benefits to the people who are there being represented. But if we have a homogenous presentation of, you know, what a teacher looks like or what an academic looks like, it's a platitude to say that everybody is different, but everybody is different. And if you feel that you have to conform to that presentation, even if that presentation represents you, it can be troubling because you want to be your own authentic self. And when we see a diversity in representation, we all feel safer to be different in whatsoever regard we're different.
I was just going to jump in and just say, yeah, absolutely agree. And, you know, what I was saying about us trying to change narratives was also about really around getting non-disabled people to see the difference around them. And by kind of normalizing this idea of difference, that we are, as you say, Joanna, we are all different. There is no same. And normalizing the conversation about disability, what inclusion means, what does inclusive design mean? So when we're building cities or schools or designing the latest tech gadget or app or whatever it might be, if we design it from the perspective of inclusivity, it's actually good for everybody. It's not just good for disabled people.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we kind of touched on this a little bit, but Becca, coming to you, what do you think the current climate looks like in education or more widely with regards to understanding inclusion and true representation? Where do you think we're at in our journey with that?
Yeah, well, Joanna touched on this actually in her answer, where we actually have a huge body of evidence in terms of, you know, formal reports, research publications, and also sort of reports from charities and, you know, organisations essentially at the front line of delivering care or support to disabled people. And as I said, there's a huge body of evidence demonstrating the impact of, you know, ableism, discrimination against disabled either staff or students in higher education, and the lack of representation, the impact of the lack of disability inclusion. We know all this. And there are concrete recommendations on how to improve, you know, the whole system, basically. I guess the sticking point or the barrier is perhaps how to translate the research into policy, like either locally within your own organisation or wider nationally, in order to, you know, stimulate change. And I think that one of the, I guess, the main setbacks, or one of the main reasons why the movement in this area is so slow is because it's what Kamran said, where there's so few disabled individuals in leadership positions. Okay, they're not visible. We can't see them, particularly within the higher education sector. And I think the current stats on vice chancellors of universities that identify as being disabled, there's 5 out of 120 universities in the UK. That's 3%. And in terms of academic staff that are on a grade of professor or higher, that's again only 3% of staff identify as being disabled. And when you compare that to the undergrad intake, it's about 20% of the undergraduates coming into universities identify as disabled. And, you know, the national statistics, working age people, DWP, I think, has the figure about 20% of working age people in the UK identify as disabled. And so there's this really big disconnect between the leadership and in higher education and I guess the population that it serves. And you have to question, how can we expect such a non-diverse leadership in the sector to drive evidence-based policy change in order to improve disability inclusion and equity for disabled people in higher education?
Thank you. Yeah, I was smiling because I'd just written down disabled people in leadership. Really want to talk about that a lot more, and to challenge our attendees that are listening, you know, within their own settings. Is that happening within their own settings, and what can we do about that to try and make change in those settings? But does anyone else want to come in on that question at all about where they think we're at as a society? Joanna?
I was just going to say, if you want to see some brilliant leadership examples, the Dimensions Leaders in Learning Disability and Autism Awards will be announced soon, and there's always some really good examples of leadership on there.
I was just going to add that the percentages that Becca just mentioned, they're reflected throughout our kind of world, really, in all different sectors. If you look at the charity sector or the private sector, very similar figures. And so it's not necessarily just unique to education. I think it's a societal issue. It's an issue that is across our whole community, society, country, and world.
Thank you. Yeah, I know there's a lot going on in the chat as well. One of our attendees is saying access to work is a huge barrier for us in SEN schools. There's minimal support for our students leaving us to get into any kind of employment opportunities, paid or voluntary. And Kamran, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the work that you've done with your organisation around that.
Around access to work?
Yeah, and moving into employment opportunities once you leave school.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing we do is we run a student helpline, which is about aimed at disabled students, to make sure that disabled students understand what their rights are under law and what the obligations are on the institutions. And we will support students to kind of pick up their case and argue their case by giving them what the law actually says they should be provided with. So that's the first thing, because we think providing people with information is power. Giving that power to individual students to kind of self-advocate is really important. And then we then work with businesses to create inclusive, confident employers out there who genuinely see the value of a diverse workforce, and how getting disabled people into their business is good business sense. It's not kind of a nice thing to do. It's actually the right thing to do, because you're reflecting the community you're working in, but also you're bringing in that diversity of thinking and experience of living life differently. Seeing the world from a different perspective is so important to almost any business, whether you're producing products or whether you're delivering a service. It really doesn't matter. And I guess the other important thing is, through our policy work, is looking at the reasons why disabled students who start university or higher education then fall out. There are lots of reasons why disabled students don't finish their education, and often they're because of lack of adjustments, fluctuating health conditions that the academic institution can't deal with or hasn't designed their systems to be flexible. And then we know that the data shows that disabled people who don't complete their education, the disability employment gap is much bigger than if you achieve a good education. That narrows quite significantly. So it does make a massive difference, and we need to get that right. And access to work, I think, was what somebody was talking about. Access to work, certainly in the employment world, is one of those kind of jewels that not many people want to know about. But then when they try and access it, it can be a bit of a minefield and a nightmare to actually get the support you need. And so we are consistently kind of lobbying and raising the views of disabled people to government about how that scheme needs to improve.
Becca, did you want to add in there as well?
Yeah, just to chip in something relating to you were mentioning about the sort of dropout rates or the incompletion of rates of students in higher education. I think also the latest data also shows that disabled graduates have higher unemployment rates at 6 months post-graduation as well, compared to non-disabled peers. And I guess one of the things we need to start thinking about is, what are the reasons for that? What are the reasons for perhaps lower attainment? What are the reasons for lower levels of unemployment? And I think that, I think the reality is that it's a very complex issue around the accessibility in the workplace as well. But there are perhaps some things that we can do, I think, in the higher education sector to help prepare young people for entering the workforce. Perhaps whether it's things like supporting them for interview techniques, or whether it's supporting them with trying to even get paid or unpaid internships or work experience and things like that. And so, I think that there is a place that there are some things that we can be doing, I think, to help students post-graduation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both very much for those comments. And thinking about obviously education sector, and the majority of our attendees are teaching assistants, teachers, practitioners within special education settings. What can our attendees do to promote change within their own settings, perhaps thinking of themselves as employers, as organisations, or any other aspects? Kamran?
Great question. What can we all be doing? Well, I think the first thing is to start openly talking about difference, diversity, disability, disabled people. What is it? What are we talking about? Disabled people are not often who you think they are. It kind of really challenging yourself. So recognizing the fact that we don't talk about it and normalizing that conversation. That's the first thing. Kind of having a plan, or it's a bit like, we have diversity plans, making sure that disabled people are part of your diversity plan. Engage with disabled people, engage with your students who are disabled people, really open up to ask disabled students' experience. What's it like being there? What are the genuine challenges? And be open to hearing some hard facts, and not kind of closing down those conversations, and allowing people to be their authentic self and really kind of articulate what's going on for them. I think there's this work that institutions and academic institutions can do around kind of being part of the solution to that future pipeline. How do we encourage more disabled people to choose that as a career? So kind of looking at that, where is that pipeline? And then seeing your role in the community that you operate, about representation and talking about these issues openly, kind of admitting that you haven't got it right, but you're on a journey, and that you're working with disabled students, but also disabled people out in the community. Pretty much everywhere we're quite fortunate in the UK. There are many disabled people-led organizations up and down the country who will be incredibly happy to engage with you, to tell you about that kind of lived experience, and using that lived experience to drive change in your organizations is kind of vital.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so important, and it's something we've been talking about as an organisation a lot, is exactly that. We're on a journey, we're on a learning journey, we want to do more, and it's not being afraid to admit that and to say that, and then to think about what more we can be doing to improve it. So yeah, thank you, Kamran. Joanna, do you want to come in as well?
I was just going to echo Kamran's advice to connect with advocates and disabled people themselves, because I think however well-informed we think we are, especially within education, the view of disability will always be filtered through the world that you inhabit. And so it's really worth going and looking for those advocacy organisations where you can get it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And in terms of access, I'm hesitating slightly, because I realise I'm on the panel today because I run the Sensory Projects, and I'm a published author, and for more than a decade now I've been working for myself. But for autistic people, the rates of employment, the rates of full-time employment within the UK are still under 20%. And prior to running the projects, I would have been among those, in that I would have counted as being underemployed, because I only ever managed to work part-time. And as of last month, I've just taken up a position in a university, Becca. So I'm entering academia, and it has been really humbling to me to realise that despite all of the things that we could list that I've achieved in the last 10 years, it's still inaccessible to me. And I'm learning. I have been living as a capable person, as a high achieving person for 10 years. And now I'm going back into a setting where I don't know whether I will be able to achieve. And so it's very much about capacity and context. If you can change the environment, if you can make those adjustments, you get a better workforce. And again, it's one of those things, it's not just for the person that you change it for. Lots of other people will benefit from those adaptations too. And so my biggest piece of advice is just listen to those people, because my university have been amazing at listening to me so far. And anytime I've mentioned something, they've gone, right, let's change it. And hopefully that will keep changing, and they'll make a little pathway for me to get through. But at the moment, it feels very inaccessible.
Thank you for that honesty as well, and that story of your own lived experience. I think it's what we all need to hear, it's what we need to keep hearing, and I think your bravery in continuing to raise the challenges that you're facing and working with your university is so important. So thank you for sharing that. Becca, did you want to add anything around how we can promote more change in education? What can we all be doing to make some positive difference?
I guess my approach in academia has always been kind of like, I guess, gather together people, like-minded people. So it started out just gathering people in my organisation that held similar interests to improve things, and then over time you can gather similar like-minded people across other employers in your sector, and you kind of like can have a bit of a snowball effect to kind of, I guess, be louder and be more challenging to the way things are currently, and to challenge that, and to also have advice about how things could actually change for the better. And a lot of the time, sort of like the changes that need to be made are really small things that are usually cost-free. There's no real cost to those. It's just, perhaps a very small change to the way a process is done, or the way that room bookings are done, or something. It's something very small, and there's lots of these sorts of things that, if those changes are made, the impact on disabled individuals is absolutely huge. And I think the other thing is around prioritising or creating, I suppose, generating opportunities for disabled students to gain experience in real world work, or in whatever career opportunities they want to pursue. But we need to start creating opportunities for them to gain experience in those different areas, because, as mentioned, the disabled students tend to have a higher unemployment rate. And what Joanna just said, I know from the data that students with autism or other communication impairments are the most likely to be unemployed out of all the categories of disabled students. They are the ones that are most likely to be unemployed after 6 months post-graduation. And so, I think helping those students before they graduate, and working with perhaps local businesses or industry in your region to provide those opportunities for work experience might help them when they graduate and try to find those jobs.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Becca. Joanna, thinking about your work with the sensory projects and your work with people who experience the world in a sensory way, how important is that representation for that population and those students? Is it even more so important? What would you say with thinking about those students in mind?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not long ago in our history that these people were put away in institutions, locked away and forgotten about. We are so close to those times, and in a world where we get our information in a different way, it's important that we have representation. I know it sounds silly to say, but like across social media and platforms like that. My sister is a research librarian, and she did a piece of research looking at where people get their information from. And we are watching different news feeds, we get our awareness from different places. And one of the challenges that I face in my work with that population is that quite often it's difficult to be allowed to share images of them, or to be allowed to share video footage of them. And that's done protectively, which is obviously coming from a great place, but we're not protecting people by hiding them. If we need them needs to be met, then it's really important that we see them and that we hear from them. And if you don't communicate in a standardized format, then we need to listen in a different way. And so when we're thinking about representation and change, and a lot of this has been focused on work, and I think it's one lens to view a person's value through, isn't it? And the leaders list that I mentioned earlier is a great way of seeing how people can affect the lives of others in lots and lots of different ways. And it's not necessarily all about work. I've gone in about 3 different directions there, haven't I? Yes, it's important.
No, thank you. It's really useful, because that's exactly the kind of lens I wanted to bring into focus a little bit more. And I know a lot of people will be, wanting to hear more about that, Joanna. So is there anything else you wanted to add on that? I think it is so important, and I think that's exactly what you say. We value people's worth based on their work and their contribution back, within that way a lot of the time, don't we? And there's so much more to an individual. I read an incredible book called Made Possible, which is a brilliant book for a compilation of stories of people with learning disabilities. And yeah, brilliant book. I'd recommend to everybody. But yeah, if there's anything else you wanted to add on that, Joanna, I'm sure people would love to hear you speak and hear about your work with the sensory projects as well.
I think if you were to build on that, you would build on listening in different ways. It's actually something that I'm just beginning to explore in my doctoral research, because but I'll get geeky really quickly. It's about how we create meaning. And in part, we create meaning by sharing words and writing things down, but we create meaning in a multitude of ways. Like if you went and watched a contemporary dance performance, you would feel meaning, and you're not making that up. An impression is being made on you, and there is meaning created when we interact. When we interact with an object, we learn about that object. When we interact with another person, when we interact with an animal, we create meaning. And so the opportunity to connect and interact with people who are different is the opportunity to construct meaning and to be informed by that meaning, and then that would have an impact on your the advocacy world and things like that. But if people want to know more about that sort of thing, or about people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, I popped my social media stuff into the chat earlier.
Amazing. Thank you very, very much. I suppose to wrap up today's session, I've literally scribbled so many notes everywhere of things I want to take away to read more about. So thank you. It's been a brilliant, brilliant talk. Any final comments? One action you would like people to take away from today, or any final comments you would like to leave people with as we leave today's session from any of you? I'd love to hear them.
I guess from my side, Charlotte, I would say as an organization of disabled people, our role is to engage with disabled people. And so that's the one message I would give is kind of walk towards the unknown. So walk towards the things that are kind of look a bit scary, talking to people from different backgrounds, different lived experiences of impairment, health conditions, and engage and start to kind of learn and understand and base your decisions on the lived experience of disabled people. That's what I would say is engage and connect.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you, Kamran. Joanna, any final comments or thoughts? Putting you all on the spot now.
It's difficult to say something different when Kamran says such a good thing. I am back to engaging with people and listening to people and listening in all ways.
Thank you. And Becca, final words.
Yeah, it's difficult because it kind of covered pretty much everything that I would probably suggested. I think for me, we need to find a way to encourage or lobby for better representation in leadership, regardless of what sector you're in. There needs to be a much greater diversity, because at the end of the day, if you're a leader in your sector, you are shaping the future direction of your sector. So disabled people need representation in that. How we can achieve that, I don't know. I think but it's personally what I think needs to change and what we should focus on as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think all of our attendees will have taken a huge amount away from that. And no matter what your role is within your school or your therapy team or whatever setting you are from watching us from today, I think we can all have a massive, massive influence within our own field. So I would definitely take a lot of the points away from today, see what change you can influence within your own setting. And thank you very much for sharing your experiences. It's been a really wonderful talk. I can see the chat next to me going bonkers. Everyone's very excited with what you've said. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know, Kamran, you've got to rush off to another meeting. But yes, thank you very much. And for everyone watching, that was our last session of the MOVE conference. We will be coming back together in a few minutes, a couple of minutes, to do our Move Awards, which is very exciting, and to announce next year's Move Day theme, and just to wrap up the conference as well. So yeah, you'll find that session back in your schedule of events, and we'll see you all there shortly. But to our panelists again, honestly, a huge thank you. I've taken so much away from this session, and I can see from the chat that everybody else has as well. So I really do appreciate you giving up your time to be with us today. And I look forward to kind of connecting with you more in the future and seeing what else we can do to influence change across the sector. So thank you very much, and I will see you all very shortly.